Hello everyone, my name is Bai Li from the University of Toronto, and today I will be presenting my long paper called Neural Reality of Argument Structure Constructions. Let's first talk about argument structure constructions, which is a theory of how meaning is assigned to sentences. In the traditional lexicalist view, the meaning of a sentence is determined by the main verb. So for an instance, here's a sentence, John kicks Mary the ball. According to this lexicalist view, the verb kick assigns all of the semantic roles to the syntactic arguments. For example, the agent is the subject, and then the direct object is the recipient, and the indirect object is the theme. Now in the constructionist view, syntactic structures are associated with meaning. For example, here is the ditransitive structure. We have a subject and two objects. This construction is associated with transfer meaning, where the subject transfers the indirect object to the direct object, and the verb just specifies the manner that transfer happens. And this is independent for the verb, so any verb can take place here. So most existing work on linguistic probing, they assume some kind of generative syntax framework. So there's been a lot of work that probe language models for a phenomenon such as agreement, licensing, movement, and so on. In our paper, we probe language models for argument structure constructions, which is a phenomenon from construction grammar. Here are four argument structure constructions. We've already seen the ditransitive construction, which is transfer meaning. There's the transitive construction, like Bob cut the bread, where the subject acts on the object. Next, the cause motion construction. Bob cut the bread into the pan. Here, the subject causes the object to move along a path. Finally, there's a resultative construction. For example, Bob cut the bread apart. And here, the subject causes the object to become a certain state. In our work, we probe for whether language models contain knowledge of argument structure constructions by adapting several studies from psycholinguistics. The first study that we look at is by Bencini and Goldberg 2000, and this is an influential study, one of the first to show psycholinguistic evidence for argument structure constructions. Here we have four verbs and four constructions, so for each verb and each construction we have one sentence. They asked the participants to sort these set of 16 verbs into four different piles, without telling them exactly how they should sort them by. So they sorted the sentences by intuitively grouping the sentences with closer meaning together. And the point of this exercise was to see whether they sorted more by verb or more by construction. So the researchers calculated the edit distance for each participant to a pure verb or a pure construction sort. Here are the results of this experiment. In the native speakers, they found that they sorted more by construction than by verb. So the construction deviation, which is in green, is lower than the verb deviation, which is in orange. Next, in a subsequent study involving Chinese speakers who were learning English, they found that the beginners sorted more by verb, and the advanced speakers sorted more by construction. So as they gained more proficiency in English, they were closer to the native speakers, and this is probably because the beginners looked at more of a surface level cue, like which verb was used, but then the construction was more central to determining the sentence meaning. Now I will talk about how we adapt these studies to language models. So we used the Roberta model, which was trained with roughly 30 billion tokens, as well as several versions of the mini-beta models, which were trained with 1 million up to 1 billion tokens. We obtained the sentence vectors from the language models by feeding the sentence into the model, and then taking the average contextual vectors at the second to last layer. For evaluation, we used the clustering distance to a pure verb or pure construction sort. So to do this, we first run agglomerative clustering into four different clusters, and then we use a bipartite matching algorithm to compute the distance to a pure verb or pure construction sort. And finally, The lower means that the clustering more closely matches either the verb or the construction sort, similar to the human experiment. Here are the results of the experiment. We find that as the language models get more data, they sort more by constructions than by verb. So the green bar gets smaller and smaller when the amount of pre-training data increases. And this is similar to the trend in humans. We also conducted the experiment in several other languages. Some other researchers have done similar sentence sorting experiments in German, Italian, and Spanish. We used the multilingual BERT as well as several monolingual language models for each language. The human results are not very consistent, but we find that in the language models, they always prefer construction over verb for sorting. Let's summarize what we have done for this study. So we have probed language models for knowledge of argument structure constructions using a sentence sorting setup. We found that the constructions contribute more to sentence meaning than verbs in these language models. And furthermore, as language models get bigger and bigger, they more and more derive the sentence meaning from constructions rather than surface features. And this is very similar to the human studies on second language learners. Next, we turn to a study by Johnson and Goldberg, 2013, and this study used structural priming to study Jabberwocky constructions. And here's the setup. The participants saw a sentence like this: he daxed her the Norp, and then they were asked whether gave or tobe is a real word, which one is a real word. And the point of this exercise is that the response times were faster when the conditions were congruent. So for example, in the sentence, it was a ditransitive sentence, and this has the same transfer meaning as the word gave. So when the verb meaning matches the construction, you expect that the response times will be faster than when the verb does not match the construction. So now let's talk about how we adapt this to language models. We use the Roberta-based model, and we generate sentences from templates, like the ones on the left. And we do this by filling in random words with the correct part of speech for each construction. This is slightly different from the original study, which used sentences words like daxed and norp, and we wanted to avoid this because these tokens were never seen during training, so it will be out of domain. And instead we use random real words of the right part of speech. Now let's talk about adapting this experiment to language models. Instead of priming, we used a setup based on Euclidean distance, because there is no standard way of priming for language models. So take a sentence like, she traded her the epicenter. Here we measure the Euclidean distance to 4 verbs: gave, made, put, and took. And these are meant to be prototype verbs to represent the 4 different constructions. And here the word gave is highlighted in green because it is congruent with the sentence, which is the ditransitive construction. And the others are incongruent because they are semantically unrelated to the ditransitive construction. And in addition to these 4 verbs, we also tried 4 lower frequency variants: handed, turned, placed, and removed, instead of gave, made, put, and took. And here are the results. So first, we find that there is lower Euclidean distance when the prototype verb is congruent with the construction, and this is true for both the high and low frequency experiments. So this means that when the verb is congruent, then it is closer to the verb in a sentence than when the verb is incongruent. And furthermore, this effect is more reliable for the high frequency verbs than the low frequency verbs. So if we look at the diagonals in the high frequency case, it is always the lowest distance one, and the lowest one in the row. whereas this is not so reliable in the low frequency verbs. And this is probably because the high frequency verbs generate contextual embeddings more reliably than lower frequency verbs, which have more noise. Let's summarize what we did here. So in this study, we probed language models for knowledge of argument structure constructions using Jabberwocky sentences. And we found that Roberta can associate meaning to abstract constructional templates without help from lexical overlap. So even in sentences where all of the lexical cues can be removed, we still find that it is able to associate the correct prototype verb with the abstract Jabberwocky sentences. Finally, let's conclude what we have learned in this paper. So in this paper, we found some evidence for argument structure constructions in language models, extending earlier work in linguistic probing. We have also found that psycholinguistic experiments is a good way of informing ways to probe language models, because they have experiment methodologies that we can adapt, and they also have data that we can use for language model probing. Thank you. I hope you learned something from this presentation. And finally, here's a list of references.